You're watching JCT TV. This is Bible study for the 21st century. Welcome, friends. Jim Cantelon here. We're right in the early beginnings, really, of the book of Matthew. We're in chapter 8, but most of our focus for the last several months has been chapters 5, 6, and 7. But now we're beginning to move a bit, and we're into chapter 8, and it's full of great material, so challenging, so inspiring, and I can hardly wait to get to it, share it with you. We'll do that right after this. I'm here with Teresa Melilla at the Home of Mercy, which is an entire compound now that is a real miraculous transformation from what it used to be. And we're in front of a brand new building, Teresa, that has just recently been built.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about this.
This building is the main hall, and during the cold season we had nowhere to meet. So this is now the hall that we meet in during the cold season, but also it's a dining room. It has a kitchen, and this is the serving area you see here. It opens up. So we've had training here, quite a bit of training for counselors, for the students in the Berean and the Bible study groups, but also people who come in home-based care. We did the training here for home-based care too. So people come in here and they can learn in here, but they can also sleep in here. Because it's a sleeping facility. At night they can use the facility to sleep. It's got a kitchen, it's got a stores, and this is a serving area. But it's very airy, as you can see. It's got a lot of windows. So even in the hot season we can still sit in there. But during the rainy season we don't normally have a place because the rain comes into the other hall. So this is the perfect place for us. And even the children, when they come, the survivors, this is where we sit with them.
You mentioned the survivors. It's called the Home of Mercy for a reason. We can maybe talk more about that in another segment, but you do have a number of little girls and young women who've been rescued from sexual abuse.
About 66 right now.
So they're right adjacent to this building, and they have access for feeding and all the other things you're talking about.
And we meet every Friday with them in the afternoons. Since they've started school, now we're going to be meeting on Saturday.
Terrific.
Yeah.
Thanks, Teresa.
You're welcome.
A big, huge, really, maybe the biggest as far as the people are concerned, part of Jesus' ministry was his healing ministry. Jesus did not set himself up as a faith healer or as some kind of traveling circus show of miracles. But the fact is that being who he was, he had mastery over illness like no one in history. And he had compassion for people. He wasn't interested in putting on a show. In fact, as we saw last time with a leper, he heals the guy and says, "Now, don't tell anybody." Time and again, he would do this. He wasn't interested in publicity. In fact, publicity was a problem for him because there were a few occasions when there was upwards of 50,000 people swarming around where he was, all of them, clamoring for his attention. So he wasn't interested in putting on a show. He wasn't interested in publicity. Publicity, in many ways, was a hindrance for him. But he had compassion for people. And time and again, you see him as he ministers healing. The gospel writers will say, and moved with compassion, he, whatever, touched, reached out, spoke, in the healing process. And so we looked at the healing of a man with leprosy last time, but now we're going to look at another very interesting sort of long distance healing. Can I call it that? Let's look at chapter 8, verse 5. When Jesus had entered Capernaum, a centurion came to him asking for help. Lord, he said, my servant lies at home paralyzed, suffering terribly. Jesus said to him, shall I come and heal him? The centurion replied, Lord, I do not deserve to have you come under my roof. Just say the word, and my servant will be healed, for I myself am a man under authority, with soldiers under me. I tell this one, go, and he goes. That one, come, and he comes. I say to my servant, do this, he does it. When Jesus heard this, he was amazed, and said to those following him, truly I tell you, I've not found anyone in Israel with such great faith. I say to you that many will come from the east and the west, will take their places at the feast with Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the subject of the kingdom will be thrown outside into the darkness, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Then Jesus said to the centurion, go, let it be done, just as you believed it would. And his servant was healed at that moment. Now, let me get to, back to verse 5 here. A centurion was a Roman, and he was in the army, and he was in charge of 100 men. Makes sense, right? Centurion, century, centennial, 500, or I should say 100. He was in charge of 100 men. So as such, he was a man of authority. The wonder of this healing, like that of the leper, goes beyond the eradication of an affliction. In this case, the wonder is that a Roman centurion, a Gentile, exclamation mark, in the Jewish context, exclamation mark, a Gentile, should have greater faith than Jesus had seen in any Israelite, including his own disciples. This is the wonder of this miracle. The centurion says to Jesus, you don't bother. You don't have to come to my house. You don't have to touch my servant to heal him. You just say the word, and your authority is enough. This was amazing. And the fact is that the centurion's faith was not blind. He had perhaps seen Jesus at work, and he certainly was aware of Jesus' reputation. He may even have witnessed the remarkable transformation of the leper we looked at last time, as he had exited the priest's house at Capernaum, a clean bill of health in his hand. The centurion put 2 and 2 together. Jesus has authority over illness like I have authority over my 100 soldiers. I command, they obey. Jesus commands, sickness flees. My servant is ill. Jesus heals him by a word. That was his reasoning. And in a sense, the centurion is an example of what I refer to as faith feeding reason. Now, let me explain. Just like a scientist has a vision, faith, if you will, for a cure, and then applies his reason to the pursuit of it, so too a believer sees the healing and then takes steps to the healer. But the reasonable steps have got to be preceded by faith. Remember the ask, seek, and knock a few weeks ago? All predicated on the belief that the solution can and will be found. Faith is not the throw of a dice. Faith is a belief that Jesus is who he says he is, and if I put my trust in him, he will do his part. It's no mistake that the founding fathers of America established as the statement of faith for the nation. In God we trust. That has stood the test of time. In the Canadian government, he shall have dominion from sea to sea and from the river to the ends of the earth. Right there, carved into the rock of the Parliament buildings. He shall have dominion from sea to sea. We've come a long way, perhaps, from those founding fathers' worldview. But the fact of the matter is that the DNA, if you will, of faith has been forever not just etched, but carved into the rock, the granite rock of the Houses of Parliament on Parliament Hill in Ottawa and into the very core of America's heart of In God We Trust. Right there, you see it on the money. I mean, it's not rocket science. You put your trust in God, God proves himself trustworthy. So Jesus shakes his head at this guy. Here he is, he's a Gentile. I'm a Jew. Jesus was a Jew. I haven't seen faith like this anywhere in my Jewish culture, even my own disciples. It's just amazing that this man can have this kind of faith. And of course, you know, the lookers on, all being Jewish, and the disciples themselves would take this as a kind of a harsh blow. What? You'll see from time to time in Jesus' life and ministry that he draws the contrast between the childlike faith of the Gentile and the kind of the hard-skinned view of Jesus on the part of his own culture, his own peers, his own family even at times. And it shouldn't surprise us that here in our world, you know, 2,100 years past the ministry of Jesus, that we should find similar hardness of heart on the part of so many. I mean, really, to put your trust in the Lord this way is a remarkable leap of faith. You know, the Bible says we walk by faith and not by sight. I'm all for employing my mind. In fact, the Apostle Paul in Romans 12, 1 and 2 says that we should search the scriptures. We should not be conformed to this world, but be transformed by the renewing of our mind. Our mind. You know, I'm all for engaging the mind. But ultimately, friends, what comes first is that call of the Spirit to the heart. There's something visceral. You know, in the Jewish worldview, this was where man really existed, not up here, but here. Call it intuitive knowledge, call it what you will. But the fact of the matter is that we know that God is pulling us to himself. We know it. There are those who don't know it, never experience it. And my prayer for them is that one day they will. I'm not here to judge anyone. But the fact of the matter is, nobody comes, Jesus himself said this, unless the Father draw him. Okay? So if you're a believer today, it's because God the Holy Spirit has drawn you to himself, either through your family, through your church, through circumstances, or through just a personal encounter, an unusual epiphany, an awareness of God that just kind of blindsided you, whatever. This is the supra-rational, supernatural work of heaven itself calling you to himself. And that call should never be ignored. Hi friends, Jim Cantelon here. I'm in Malawi in a very, very interesting setting where I am with a number of leaders who oversee various aspects of our partner ministry here called Somebody Cares. And I just might read some of what they represent. We have leaders here who are involved with youth, some with safe motherhood, others with granny's care, some in the health sector, some in the education sector, some in the legal sector, believe it or not, almost acting as paralegals, some as administrators, village pastors, and chiefs. And I have the great privilege of spending 2 or 3 hours with them, just taking them through some of the strong biblical principles that are, if you will, the infrastructure of the ministry of Somebody Cares. And so here they are. These are key leaders, chosen leaders, and they're all here to praise the Lord. So we go from the healing of the centurion's son, or servant, I should say, to another miraculous work of Jesus. not spectacular, but it's recorded here, so we need to read it. Verses 14 to 17 of Matthew 8. When Jesus came into Peter's house, he saw Peter's mother-in-law lying in bed with a fever. He touched her hand, and the fever left her. She got up and began to wait on him. When evening came, many who were demon-possessed were brought to him, and he drove out the spirits with a word and healed all the sick. Jesus probably had a room in Peter's house in Capernaum. I've been to Capernaum countless times. As you know, I lived in Israel for 7 years, and I used to broadcast in southern Lebanon, and I used to drive from Jerusalem down to the Jordan Valley, up the Jordan Valley, past Tiberias, past Capernaum, up the Mount of past the Mount of Beatitudes, to the Upper Galilee, and all the way up to the southern Lebanese border. And then with a military pass that the Israeli military had given me, I would go into Lebanon and broadcast the gospel a couple shifts a week from a little radio station that was built in an abandoned customs house, presenting the gospel to southern Lebanon and to northern Israel. It was a privilege. I loved it and did it for several years. Anyway, I got to know Capernaum really well because I drove by it time and time again, and many times I would go in, and sometimes there would be groups of tourists from North America who would contact me because I was pastoring the church we planted there, King of Kings, and they would say, "Can you come and give us a little bit of Bible teaching in Capernaum?" And I was happy to do it when I could. Let me just describe to you what it's like. The Sea of Galilee is not a sea; it's a lake. Roughly 12 miles long, 6 miles wide. By North American standards, it's a puddle, really. It's not huge at all. But it was a major player, in Israel's history, and has been until recently. Until recently, back when I was living there, the only real fresh water that was available in most of Israel came from the Sea of Galilee. Now, there were aquifers along the west coast between Tel Aviv and Herzliya and Caesarea up to Haifa. But over time, those aquifers began to be overused, and brackish water began to come in from the ocean. And so there was a real crisis on top of a few years of drought, and the Sea of Galilee at one point was down about 6 or 10 feet, as I recall. And so it was a real crisis. But now, Israel has invented a very cost-efficient way of making fresh water out of ocean water. And they've got 3 plants in the Mediterranean Ocean, and they're making so much fresh water now, they're actually exporting it. There you go. But anyway, Capernaum was a fishing village right on the northern shore of that lake. But it was also, as it turned out, a bit of a commercial center because it was on the Via Maris, the way of the sea, a trading route that came all the way from North Africa, right up through Israel, up into Syria and Turkey and Mesopotamia. It was a very important trade route, and so Capernaum was always full of camel caravans and businessmen, and it had a lot of roadside kiosks selling all kinds of things and a lot of business going on. So in that sense, it was a very highly populated commercial area. At the same time, it was a fishing village right on the shore. Well, when you go to Capernaum, you walk into the ruins of the old village, and right there, just a few steps from the lake, is the remains of Peter's house. Now, a lot has happened to it over the years. There were 1 or 2 churches built on it over the years, and then they, fell apart or were destroyed. But then there was another church built over it, and it's there to this day. And they built it in such a way that it's kind of on pillars, not vertical, but semi-horizontal pillars, so you can actually see, the ruins of the original house. But like I say, it's just steps from the lake. And then a few steps from Peter's house is the ruins of the ancient Capernaum synagogue. Now, what's there now goes back maybe to the 4th century, but the foundation is basalt rock, black rock. Mount Hermon was volcanic at one time, spewed a lot of volcanic material over the centuries, and most of the rocks from the upper down towards the lower Galilee are all black basalt rocks. And so you can see the original foundation stones there. But it's a beautiful old 4th century ruins of a synagogue. And this would have been the synagogue that Jesus would attend, when he was looking, when he was doing room and board, I guess you'd call it, at Peter's house. So the distance from the synagogue to Peter's house would be 50 feet, maybe. And then from Peter's house down to the lake, 50 to 75 feet. Very compact, very closely situated, one to the other. And then surrounding the synagogue, some beautiful trees and gardens, and there's an olive press, and it's just a beautiful, beautiful setting. I love it there. So Jesus probably had a room there in Peter's house, a permanent boarder, if you will, in his adopted hometown when he wasn't on the road. And Capernaum did become his adopted hometown. He didn't spend much time in Nazareth. Capernaum was a spot because his ministry was more in that area than anywhere else. And for sure, he knew Peter's mother-in-law very well. She too lived there with her daughter, Peter's wife, and she managed the household. So I think we can safely suggest that Peter's mother-in-law was also Jesus' friend. They were certainly more than casual acquaintances. Now, most Bible commentators suggest that Peter's mother-in-law's fever was malaria. In the Hula Valley, just in several hundreds of feet above Capernaum, as you go up into the upper Galilee, there was basically a swamp there. It was called the Hula Lake, but it was mostly a swamp. And it had conditions in combination with the moisture and the heat of incubating millions of mosquitoes, many of whom were malarial. So malaria was all too common in Capernaum and that entire region. And as is the case today in many parts of our world, it certainly was the case then, malaria can and does kill people. Severe illness and sometimes death. So Jesus goes to the house and he sees Peter's mother-in-law suffering this horrible fever, lying in her bed. He touches her, heals her. So effectively that just in a moment she's up and serving him. In other words, getting dinner ready and having a friendly conversation. Just another day in Capernaum, for her. Not surprised that Jesus could do this. That's what he did. And then afterwards, he goes out. People have already gathered on the house because Jesus is there. They're probably 20 and 30 feet thick, or deep, I should say. And they need healing, and he begins to heal them. And the wonder of this story may have been that Jesus healed both at home and outside the home. He wasn't a performer for the crowds. He cared for those who cared for him. And this is so special. Sometimes we don't give Jesus credit for his humanity. He was fully human, even as he was fully God. And he understood and empathized with people's suffering. And as I say, he did it not for show, but for the sake of compassion. So whether it was Peter's mother-in-law in the house or the scores of people who gathered that night outside the house for healing, he healed at home, he healed outside of the home. He healed out in the valley, the villages, the hills, by the sea. He was the healer.
Often friends like you are curious about what WOW does with your donations. And as I've often said on the television program, we are concerned about home-based care, especially for those who are dying, orphans and widows, of which there are tens of thousands over the past 23 years. But one of our responsibilities with home-based care is making sure that there's some nourishment available in these homes where care is being provided. And as some of you may recall, in March of this year, or 2023, there was a major cyclone called Freddy that struck Mozambique and Malawi. And Malawi was badly hit. Infrastructure was wiped out, roads, culverts, outside latrines, but the maize crop was severely damaged to the point where the cost of maize, which is a basic food component for Malawian everyday people, has more than doubled. And so our partner on the ground, Somebody Cares, contacted me about an urgent need for maize to help our orphans and widows through this difficult time. And so with your help, we managed to raise enough for a huge amount of maize here. I think this is about $15,000 worth. We need to double this, at least. And as the Lord speaks to your heart, if you can help us with this, wow, what a difference it will make in, as Jesus called them, the lives of the least of these. So thanks for your consideration.
I love the fact that Jesus had to board somewhere. Now, on another occasion, he says, and we're actually going to get to it next time, foxes have holes, birds of the air have nests, Son of Man has nowhere to lay his head. Basically what he was saying was, I've got no permanent dwelling. But we have no record of him having to sleep rough, as they call it, out in the elements. But because he had a number of people in his circuit of ministry who gave him food and shelter, and also to his people as they traveled with him. But nevertheless, he didn't own a car. He didn't own a house. And here's the Son of God who's come from the very wealth of the palaces, if you will, of heaven, to this very lowly, humble life. It's a good lesson to all of us when we tend to think of ourselves more highly than we ought to think. Thanks for watching. See you next time.